Jordan Carter had always believed in hard work. At 32 years old, he had carved a reputation as one of the most diligent and innovative employees at Sterling and Company, a well-known marketing firm in downtown Chicago. Tall and broad-shouldered, Jordan carried himself with quiet confidence. His deep brown skin, neatly trimmed beard, and intelligent dark eyes made him stand out in every boardroom he entered, not just for his appearance, but for his commanding presence. He had a sharp mind and an even sharper work ethic. Despite growing up in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce, he had worked his way through college, earning a degree in business and marketing. Jordan was not just an employee, he was a strategist, a leader, someone who took initiative and found creative solutions to complex problems. But beneath his confident exterior, Jordan was aware of a lingering tension in the office, something unspoken yet ever-present. He was the only black employee in a senior role, and while most of his colleagues respected him, his boss, Thomas Whitaker, did not. Whitaker, a middle-aged man with graying blonde hair and piercing blue eyes, was known for his condescending attitude toward employees he deemed less competent. Jordan had noticed how Whitaker dismissed his ideas in meetings, ignored his contributions, and seemed irritated whenever executives praised him. But Jordan had learned to navigate these microaggressions, focusing instead on his work. He refused to let prejudice define his career. He had earned his place at Sterling and Company through sheer determination, and he wasn't going to let anything, or anyone, stand in his way. Every morning, Jordan arrived at the office early, often before anyone else. He liked the quiet before the chaos, a moment to sip his coffee, review his agenda, and prepare for the day ahead. His workstation was always organized, his calendar meticulously planned, and his tasks prioritized. His workdays were a blend of strategy meetings, client presentations, and brainstorming sessions. He thrived on collaboration, always pushing his team to think outside the box. Clients trusted him. They valued his insights, often preferring to work with him directly rather than with other senior managers. "Jordan, can you take the lead on the upcoming Miller campaign?" A colleague, Samantha, asked one morning as she passed by his desk. "Already working on it," he replied with a confident smile, pulling up a sleek PowerPoint filled with in-depth analytics. He had a habit of going the extra mile, staying late to fine-tune campaigns, mentoring junior employees, and ensuring that every project exceeded expectations. However, no matter how hard he worked, he noticed that Whitaker rarely acknowledged his efforts. If an idea of his was well received, Whitaker would find a way to take credit for it. If there was a minor issue, Jordan would be the first to be questioned. Despite this, Jordan maintained his professionalism. He believed that success would speak for itself. He had learned long ago that the best way to silence doubters was to outperform them. But deep down, he knew Whitaker wasn't just being critical. He was looking for a reason, any reason, to undermine him. Sterling and Company was a place of sharp suits, ambitious minds, and high-stakes marketing deals. The walls were lined with modern artwork, and the open-concept workspace buzzed with energy. But beneath the polished exterior, the company had an unspoken hierarchy. There were those who had connections, who had climbed the corporate ladder effortlessly because of their last names or golf course friendships. Then there were people like Jordan, who had to prove themselves twice as much to get half the recognition. Jordan had built good relationships with many of his co-workers. Samantha, a brilliant copywriter, often collaborated with him on projects, and David, a graphic designer, frequently praised his leadership. But there were others, like Eric, a junior executive who never hid his disdain for Jordan's success. One afternoon, Jordan overheard Eric whispering to another colleague, "I don't get why he gets so much responsibility. Pretty sure Whitaker is getting tired of him." Jordan pretended not to hear, but he felt the words settle in his chest. He had known from day one that he would have to work harder than everyone else. But it was moments like this that reminded him just how fragile his position was. Whitaker, meanwhile, made no effort to hide his bias. He often dismissed Jordan's contributions in meetings, interrupted him when he spoke, and praised other employees for ideas Jordan had suggested moments earlier. "You need to be more aggressive," Samantha advised one day after yet another meeting where Whitaker had overlooked his input. Jordan sighed, running a hand over his beard. "I shouldn't have to be aggressive to be heard." Samantha nodded sympathetically. "You're right, but you know how this place works." Jordan knew, and that was the problem. Jordan had been hearing whispers. There was talk of restructuring, something about realigning leadership roles. He had brushed it off at first, confident that his contributions made him indispensable. Then, during a casual conversation with a colleague from HR, he caught wind of something troubling. "They're making some changes," she said hesitantly. "And Whitaker? Well, let's just say he's pushing for certain adjustments." Jordan felt a chill run down his spine. That evening, he stayed late at the office, going over his recent projects, ensuring every detail was perfect. He knew he had done nothing wrong. In fact, he had been excelling. But that was precisely the problem. Whitaker saw him as a threat. As he gathered his things to leave, he noticed an email notification pop up on his screen. Subject: Meeting scheduled, tomorrow 9 a.m. From Thomas Whitaker. Jordan's stomach tightened. He had a bad feeling about this. Jordan arrived at the office the next morning feeling a mix of determination and unease. He had barely slept, running through all possible reasons for the sudden meeting. Was it about the Miller campaign? A new promotion? Or was it something far worse? At exactly 9 a.m., he stepped into Whitaker's office. The blinds were half-drawn, casting long shadows across the sleek mahogany desk. Whitaker sat behind it, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Eric was there, too, leaning against the window with a smirk on his face. "Jordan, have a seat," Whitaker said coolly. Jordan took a breath and sat down, back straight, hands clasped. He had faced challenges before. This was no different. Whitaker sighed, pretending to look regretful. "I'll get straight to the point. We're making some changes in the company structure, and unfortunately, we have to let you go." Jordan's mind blanked for a second. The words didn't seem real. "Let me go," he repeated, his voice controlled but firm. "On what grounds?" Whitaker leaned back, feigning sympathy. "We're restructuring. Budget cuts, reassessments, you understand." Jordan stared at him. Budget cuts? He had brought in some of the biggest clients this year. His work had directly contributed to the company's growth. He knew this wasn't about money. Eric, still smirking, chimed in. "It's just business, man." Jordan's jaw clenched. He had seen this coming, but that didn't make it any easier. Jordan took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay composed. "So, after everything I've contributed to this company, after all the late nights and successful campaigns, you're telling me I'm being let go because of budget cuts?" Whitaker gave him a patronizing look. "It's not personal, Jordan." Jordan scoffed. "It feels personal, especially considering I'm the only senior employee being restructured out." Whitaker's expression hardened. "I don't appreciate what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating a fact," Jordan said, standing up. His voice was steady, but inside, he was burning. He wanted to yell, to demand answers, to make them admit what this really was. But he knew it wouldn't change anything. Whitaker slid a folder across the desk. "Your severance package. Review it and sign by the end of the day." Jordan didn't even look at it. He picked up his briefcase, exhaled sharply, and turned to leave. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice firm. "And you'll regret it." Walking out of the office, Jordan felt an odd sense of detachment, like he was watching someone else's life unravel. The same coworkers who once greeted him with smiles now avoided his gaze, pretending to be busy. Samantha rushed over, her face filled with concern. "Jordan, what happened?" "I got fired," he said bluntly. Her eyes widened. "What? How?" Jordan shook his head. "Whitaker. Restructuring." She cursed under her breath. "That's complete." "It doesn't matter." Jordan straightened his shoulders. "I'll figure it out." But even as he said it, doubt crept in. His job had been his identity, his stability. And just like that, it was gone. As he packed up his belongings, David, the graphic designer, approached hesitantly. "For what it's worth, man, you didn't deserve this." Jordan nodded, appreciating the sentiment, but it didn't change the reality. By the time he walked out of the building, box in hand, the crisp Chicago air stung his face. He had entered Sterling and Company that morning as a respected professional. He left as an unemployed man with no clear plan. But as he looked back at the towering office, something inside him shifted. They thought they had silenced him. They were wrong. 2 days after his termination, Jordan sat in his apartment, scrolling through job listings with little enthusiasm. His inbox was filled with rejection emails, automated responses from companies that hadn't even looked at his resume. It was demoralizing, but he refused to let despair consume him. Then his phone buzzed. "Samantha, you need to see this. Check your email." Confused, Jordan opened his inbox. A forwarded message from an anonymous source popped up, containing an internal memo from Sterling and Company. His eyes scanned the document, and his stomach tightened. The memo outlined the so-called restructuring plan, but it didn't mention budget cuts. Instead, it contained a list of employees being phased out to make way for new hires. Next to Jordan's name, a note read, "Concerns about company culture fit." Company culture fit. The phrase made his blood boil. It was coded language, an excuse used by businesses to push out people they didn't want but couldn't legally fire. He gripped his phone, his mind racing. They hadn't just let him go. They had targeted him, and they were planning to replace him with someone who fit their mold better, someone who wasn't black. Jordan inhaled sharply. His dismissal wasn't just unfair. It was illegal, and he wasn't going to let it slide. Jordan immediately called Samantha. She picked up on the first ring. "Tell me everything you know," he said. "I overheard Eric talking to HR." She replied, her voice tense. "They already have a replacement lined up. Some guy from Whitaker's golf club. No experience, but he's white." Jordan finished, the word bitter on his tongue. Samantha hesitated before confirming. "Yeah." A deep anger settled in his chest. "I appreciate you telling me this, Sam. I had to. This isn't right," she said. "But be careful, Jordan. They'll try to bury this." He knew she was right. Sterling and Company was a powerhouse, and Whitaker had influence. Fighting them wouldn't be easy. But Jordan wasn't alone. That night, he met with an employment lawyer, Linda Garcia, who had experience with workplace discrimination cases. As he laid out his story, she listened intently. "This isn't just wrongful termination," she said, her expression firm. "This is systemic racism disguised as corporate policy. We have a case, Jordan." For the first time in days, Jordan felt a sense of direction. He wasn't just a man who had lost his job. He was a man about to fight back. That night, Jordan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The weight of what he was about to do pressed down on him. Taking legal action against a company as powerful as Sterling and Company was no small feat. They had money, connections, and a whole team of lawyers who would do everything in their power to discredit him. What if he lost? What if he became another statistic? Just another black professional forced out of corporate America without justice. His thoughts drifted to his parents. They had worked tirelessly to give him opportunities they never had. His mother, a retired schoolteacher, had always told him, "You don't let people take what you've earned." And that's exactly what Whitaker and Eric had done. Jordan wasn't naive. He knew how these stories usually ended. Companies like Sterling and Company rarely faced consequences. People like Whitaker continued climbing the corporate ladder, leaving a trail of discarded careers behind them. But Jordan wasn't going to let that happen to him. This wasn't just about his job. It was about principle. By morning, his doubts had faded. He picked up his phone and dialed Linda. "Let's do this," he said. And just like that, the battle began. Over the next few weeks, Jordan and Linda built their case. They gathered testimonies from former employees who had similar experiences. Samantha discreetly provided more internal documents, exposing a clear pattern of racial bias in hiring and firing practices. But the real turning point came when Linda discovered a critical piece of evidence. A recorded conversation between Eric and another executive, joking about how they had to clean up the company's image by bringing in more relatable employees. Jordan clenched his fists as he listened to it. This was proof. The lawsuit was officially filed. News of the case spread quickly, and soon, whispers about Sterling and Company's unethical practices began circulating in professional circles. Whitaker and Eric had underestimated him, but they were about to learn that firing Jordan Carter was the worst mistake they had ever made. The lawsuit had been filed. Now it was a waiting game. At first, Sterling and Company remained silent. No official statement, no response, just an eerie corporate hush. But then, the media got involved. A journalist from a major business news outlet, intrigued by the case, reached out to Jordan for an interview. Initially hesitant, he agreed after Linda reassured him that public pressure could work in their favor. The next morning, the article dropped. Former employee sues Sterling and Company over alleged racial discrimination. It spread fast. Social media picked it up, sparking heated discussions. Comments poured in, some supportive, some dismissive, and some outright racist. Whitaker could no longer ignore it. A company-wide email landed in inboxes that evening. Sterling and Company denied all allegations, calling the lawsuit baseless and an attempt to exploit company restructuring. But Jordan wasn't deterred. Later that night, he received another email from someone unexpected. Former employees of Sterling and Company were coming forward. People he had never met, who had worked there years before, shared eerily similar stories. They had been pushed out the same way. The so-called restructuring had been happening for years, only affecting people of color. Jordan stared at the messages flooding in. This wasn't just his fight anymore. The next day, as Jordan and Linda strategized, her phone rang. She answered, her face shifting from curiosity to disbelief. When she hung up, she turned to Jordan. "You won't believe this," she said. "Someone inside Sterling and Company wants to talk." 30 minutes later, in a dimly lit parking garage, they met with a senior HR executive from the company, a woman in her 50s, visibly shaken but determined. "My name is Carol," she said, "and I can't stay silent anymore." Carol confirmed everything. How HR was pressured to filter out Black employees under the guise of cultural fit. How leadership never promoted people of color beyond a certain level. How Whitaker and Eric laughed about how easy it was to clean house without getting caught. She handed over documents, internal emails, directives from upper management, proof that Sterling and Company had been actively engaged in racial discrimination for years. Jordan's heart pounded. This wasn't just proof. This was a smoking gun. "I know what I'm risking," Carol said, "but I can't be part of this anymore." Linda placed a reassuring hand on hers. "You're doing the right thing," she said. Jordan met Carol's gaze. "So am I." Sitting in Linda's office later that night, Jordan flipped through the files Carol had given them. His hands shook. This was it. For weeks, he had been fighting, pushing back against the injustice done to him. But now, with these documents in hand, he realized something deeper. This fight wasn't just about him. It was about the countless people before him who had been silenced. The employees who had been forced out. The systemic discrimination that had been buried under corporate jargon for years. He thought of his parents again, his mother's voice echoing in his mind. "You don't let people take what you've earned." Tears welled up in his eyes. For so long, he had felt powerless, cast aside, unwanted. But he wasn't powerless now. He had the truth, and he had a voice. Jordan turned to Linda. "Let's take them down." She smiled. "Let's make sure they never do this again." With the final pieces in place, they prepared to go public. And the world was about to witness Sterling and Company's reckoning. The lawsuit exploded in the media. The evidence from Carol, the HR whistleblower, was undeniable. Emails, directives, and discriminatory hiring patterns were laid bare for the world to see. Sterling and Company scrambled to control the damage. Their legal team rushed to settle, hoping to avoid trial. But the court of public opinion was already in session. Boycotts began. Long-term clients severed ties, disgusted by the company's history of discrimination. Stockholders demanded answers. The company's value plummeted within weeks. And then, the biggest blow came. Whitaker was forced to resign. The board, desperate to salvage the company's reputation, cut him loose, painting him as a rogue executive who had gone against company values. But the truth was clear. He had built the culture of discrimination himself. Eric, his ever-loyal right hand, was also dismissed. And with that, the old regime crumbled. Jordan, meanwhile, won his case. The settlement wasn't just monetary. It came with a public apology from Sterling and Company and a commitment to reviewing their entire hiring and firing policies under federal supervision. But more than that, Jordan had his name back. His termination had once defined him. Not anymore. With the lawsuit settled, Jordan found himself at a crossroads. For months, he had fought to prove his worth, to show that what had been done to him was unjust. Now he was free. The question was, what came next? Offers came in from other firms. Competitors who admired his resilience. Companies eager to bring him in, not just for his skills, but for the integrity he had displayed. But Jordan had another idea. He wanted to build something of his own. With support from Linda and some of his old colleagues who had also left Sterling and Company, he launched his own consulting agency, one that focused on helping marginalized professionals navigate the corporate world. Within months, the business took off. Companies sought him out, not just for his expertise, but for his vision of an inclusive workplace. Jordan had once been discarded. Now he was leading. Sitting in his new office, Jordan took a deep breath. He thought about the past year, the struggle, the pain, the moments of doubt. He had walked into Sterling and Company believing hard work would always be enough, that if he proved himself, he would be rewarded. But the world wasn't always fair. And yet, he had fought back. He thought about the people who had reached out to him, the employees who had faced the same discrimination but never had the chance to fight. His battle wasn't just for himself. It was for them. And as he looked out the window, seeing the name of his company shining on the sign outside, he smiled. Because for the first time in a long time, he was exactly where he was meant to be. Months later, Jordan received a message. It was from Carol. She had landed on her feet, finding a job with a company that actually valued diversity. And she wasn't the only one. Other employees pushed out by Sterling and Company were moving forward, too. Justice had been served. And then, one last message came through. It was from Whitaker. A brief email. No subject line. Just 2 words. I'm sorry. Jordan stared at the screen. Then, without a second thought, he deleted it. Some apologies weren't worth accepting. He had already moved on.